Welcome to another episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Spellman, and I'm joined here with not one, but two of my lovely co-hosts. We have both Justin Brackenrich and Dwane Miller in the house, so why don't you guys say hi for me?
Hi, everyone. So this is a little bit different for us today, having all of us here, but thanks for tuning in and joining us. Dwane, you with us still?
Yes, hey everybody. Sorry if my voice is a little bit off. I'm battling a little bit of a cold, but bear with me. Great to be here today, and we're recording this in early November. Sun's shining right now, and crops are coming off. We're progressing pretty good, and as far as taking the crops off, looking for some good weather to keep this momentum going.
There you go. So there's our roll call. So you know we're all here. One of the reasons we're all here today is to talk about some back to basics. As Dwane mentioned, we're in the fall right now. Harvest is well underway, if not, nearing completion in some of our areas. So it's a good time to kind of sit down and talk about some basics of soil testing. This is a great time to get in the field if you can and do some soil testing. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Justin, why don't you maybe share a little bit about what these back to basics sessions are and what we're going to do here today?
Yeah, sure. So we kind of came up with this idea, right? We've been doing a lot of these podcasts and kind of transitioning a little to new ideas and new things. And so this idea came up as a lot of time we spend talking about what's new in wheat or biologics or nutrients or amendments in soils. But sometimes we really forget like the basic fundamental good agronomic practices, right? I go out and I visit with farmers or I have phone calls and you say like, well, when was the last time you limed? Well, when was the last time you applied nutrients, right? And these are the things that are going to help us control a lot of weeds, produce a lot of good crops. And so we decided let's just step back. We're going to run through this series. Occasionally, you're going to see one pop up, and it's going to be back to basics. We plan to do soil testing, lime and magnesium, talking a little bit more about nitrogen management, phosphorus and potassium management. Then we think, some ideas on herbicides or things too. Just kind of giving us all a good foundation, a good starting point to take up on some of these bigger, more complex conversations. Hope I summarized that well enough.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's exactly what we're trying to do here. I think, like you said, we probably in a lot of our episodes, we cover these higher level topics, and really a lot of them start with the basics, right? So as we need to make sure we're doing our basics. I think one of the episodes that was driven home was, well, two episodes. Our last episode when we talked about wheat fertility. I mean, everything came back to do your soil test, get the basics right, and then try these things. Our episode on biologicals with Connor Seibel, it was all about these are value added things, but if you don't have the basic agronomic concepts down, it's not worth your time, right? So hopefully that this can be a tool for you to use to kind of brush up on some of these topics. All right, so let's just jump straight into it. So we have some questions here to guide this conversation, but we'll just kind of pitch them around and see where we go with this. So one of the things I kind of wanted to start this conversation with is talking about like why soil tests in the first place and what's the importance of soil testing.
Well, I think, Ryan, this is really important that we started the back to basics with this one, because this episode on soil testing, because I think this is the foundation where we get everything started from. And to your point, you just mentioned two episodes that we previously stressed hard on this, and it basically lies the foundation for everything we're going to do. We farm at home too, and it's so easy for us to just get locked into, well, we throw down this much potash on the hay ground, or we do this, we do that on this crop, but if we really want to be in tune with what's going on and have an understanding and capitalize on the investment we're going to make in planting that crop, I think it's just so important to get that fertility in line and understand our baselines of where we stand with pH and nutrient pH and nutrient levels in the soil, because it's going to affect a lot of what we're going to do, and the potential for a good crop, potential for fertilizer availability, potential for herbicide activity. A lot of that is going to be based on those soil test levels.
So one of my bigger pet peeves is, and maybe that's not right. Maybe it's not a pet peeve. Maybe it's just like one of my pull your hair out kind of moments that I experience a lot. Is someone calls and they'll say, "Hey, how much boron or sulfur should I be putting out on this corn crop to make this the best crop it can be?" And I say, "Okay, when was the last time you took a soil test, and what's your soil potassium?" And they say, "Oh, geez, it's probably been 5-7 years, and I can pull it up and look." And they say, "Well, our potassium was 70 parts per million." But seriously, how much boron do I need to add, right? And like, I think that's where we start to slip on some of this is there is so much information thrown at us about what's new and micronutrients and biologics and foliars, but we're forgetting our magnesium, our phosphorus, our potassium, our pH. And so many times that I'm working in forages, right? People say, "What should I reseed with?" or "What nitrogen rate should I use?" I think we start with this soil test, right? Let's get a soil test. Let's get some phosphorus and potassium out there. And it's amazing how some of these species just show up and start to express, right? The orchard grass that you said wasn't there. Here it comes once we get some phosphorus, right? The red clover start to show up once we get some of this stuff out there. And I think that's that like real world take home. What has soil testing done for me lately is when you're not doing it, you don't know. And I'm kind of on this soapbox, but this is a big thing for me. If you woke up one day and your grasses or your corn, because you weren't testing, went from 200 bushel to 150 bushel, you'd perk up and you'd say, "What the heck happened here?" But because this isn't a bank account, this is like a slow draining effect. It takes 10 years before people start to notice this stuff sometimes, right? And they'll say, "Well, Dad did something with it 15 years ago, and I notice it's just not doing anything anymore." Right? We kind of have this hidden hunger and this slow depletion that once we can correct that, it's amazing how this playbook opens for what we can manage in our crops. Sorry, I don't mean to sound preachy, but this is a really important topic that we overlook all the time.
Sure, yeah, it's and to your point, Justin, like I think what you said, we're working in reality, right? Like as much as we think we can predict what nature does and what biology does, at the end of the day, if we're not checking ourselves along the way, there's no way for us to see if what we're doing is actually helping the crop respond, the soil respond, or it's not. And to your example with the pasture situation, I actually had a case where I had a farmer that had a he had a lot of weed issues in a pasture that he inherited. It was really patchy. He wasn't seeing some of those desirable species, and so immediately my head went to, okay, this is probably a fertility issue first, and then we can talk about whether it needs a reseed. And then he took the soil test, and it turned out a lot of his everything was at an optimum place in the nutrients, and his pH was okay. So in that case, he actually did have good fertility, and then we could make the decision, okay, this is a time to reseed, right? So it's just that piece of evidence that you can use to make a better decision and to track your decisions over time. I think it's just a really important check-in and way to assess what you're doing and how it affects reality. So we'll jump into this, what you actually get out of a soil test. So for this conversation, I think for the most part, we'll focus on Penn State soil testing. What's important to know is there's labs. I know we have viewers all over the country. A lot of universities, land grant universities, have their own soil testing labs, as well as industry. We're not saying ours is the best or anything. We just know the Penn State methods, so we're going to focus on those. One thing to lean on, and Penn State's is in this program, is that it's certified by the North American Proficiency Testing, the NAPT service. This is a program of the Science Society of America, the same program that CCAs fall under. And basically, in order to be a part of this program, it kind of ensures that your soil testing results are fairly accurate. There's a certification process that I don't really know much about, but then beyond that, labs in the program can send samples to other labs and have to at certain frequencies to make sure that they're getting similar results to another lab and there's not too much bias. So that's just kind of one way to make sure you're in getting a soil test that's accurate and reliable.
I think a lot of times we do these meetings or we talk about soil testing. Maybe Penn State wouldn't like me saying this, but the biggest thing I think that you can do for soil testing is stick with one lab. right? We're gonna go through the steps of depth and timing and all of those kind of things. But I think, like Ryan said, using the NAPT program to make sure they're an accredited lab, and then picking one and sticking with it, right? Because then we're not going to get different extractable nutrients. We're not going to get different ratios. If Penn State goes a couple years ago, we went from $9 a sample to $10 a sample. Well, don't let that $1 or something bother you and make you start looking for another lab. Pick a good lab, run with that one. That's a good way that we can catalog these things over the years and see any type of change that might happen, good or bad, right? We sometimes see bad change with some of our farming practices.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because no matter what we try, every lab is going to have their own bias. They have their own equipment, their own chemicals. So it is really important to stick with that one so that you're getting that same bias, and you can really ensure that you're responding based on the same test. So we'll talk a little bit about what a basic test gets you here. So you're gonna find your P's and your K's, so phosphorus, potassium, pH, and magnesium. That's kind of your macronutrients, the most important ones that you're going to get with the standard soil test. So maybe one of you guys can answer the question, why not nitrogen?
So nitrogen recommendations are going to be varied. It's going to be specific to the crop that you're indicating that you're going to be planting. Nitrogen isn't, well, let me back up. Nitrogen's not readily measured in the soil accurately at any one snapshot in time. So if you take a soil sample, say today, right after you put some nitrogen down, that nitrogen recommendation or the nitrogen reading might be there in the short term, but if we get a rain event, if it's applied on the soil surface and we get some volatilization, that nitrogen won't be around in the long term. So measuring nitrogen at one over a course of time is difficult to do. So the nitrogen recommendations when you analyze your put a soil test report in is going to be based on the crop that you're going to be using in that scenario, and then also your yield goal. So it's driven by two things basically: is the crop that you're planting and the yield that you're looking to get out of that crop.
And I think if you're interested in that, we have an episode and we've done a lot of work discussing things like the pre-side dress nitrogen test. And there are total nitrogen tests and stuff in your soils that you can do. They're just a different test than what you would get for kind of your standard routine sample.
Yeah, great. I think it's the reason I brought it up first is because that's one of the first questions I get about soil tests from a lot of folks when they're getting into this is like, what about my nitrogen, right? And that really is based on the crop that you're growing at the time in the plant available form because it is so dynamic, right? But your phosphorus, your potassiums, your magnesium, these are all less dynamic, and we have some level of predictability how that implementing that fertilizer will actually affect the crop that's there in the soil that's there. So Dwane hit on another important thing. What we're doing when we're looking at our soil test results, we're looking at getting soil levels of these nutrients or of your pH to an optimum level, right? And that's based on building the levels up over time. So maybe if you're doing this soil test over the course of 3 years, we're building that up to a place where it's optimum. And then we might need to step down our fertility based on our test in the future so that we keep it in that optimum range. So that's kind of a little bit of the basics of why we're doing this and how we're keeping these levels at optimum. So maybe we'll jump into how we take a soil test. So any advice from you guys on I want to take a soil test and I want to get where do I find a soil test and how do I go about taking one?
I'll start a little bit, Ryan, as far as where do we get a soil test kit? You can purchase a soil test kit from any of the Penn State Extension offices. They sell them there. Like Justin indicated before, a Penn State soil test kit is $10 per sample. You don't have to actually drive to the Penn State Extension office to grab those soil test kits if you don't want to. We'll put in the show notes the address to our soil testing lab out at Penn State University. And in there are the instructions for taking a soil sample. And you can also print out a standard soil test form, fill that out, and use your own Ziploc bag to do the sample. So you don't have to drive to the office to grab a physical sample kit. You can do those on your own. So that's where to get the soil test kit. I'll stop there and
Sure.
hand it off
So
to somebody else.
I can do how, right? I think, this is one of those big kind of it depend questions for us in extension, right? Everybody knows how we like those. We talked a little bit about picking the same lab. The other really major part of soil testing is consistent depth, right? And if you think about what happens if we're thinking about something like corn or soybeans, where we might be sampling 6 to 8 inches on that sample, right? If we come in and we take one at 6 or 8 inches, we're likely starting to hit the top of that subsoil where our pH may be a little lower than perhaps the top 2 inches. And our potassium and our stratification of nutrients will be a little different if we're talking about no-till. And so if we're, kind of just trudging along and we poke one at 8 inches and then we poke the next one at 3 inches and the next one at 4 inches, what happens is we don't get kind of this consistent representation of that top 6 to 8 inches. And so what we think about is like we have to have this spatial representation, right? This can be something like we go out and we zigzag around and we avoid wet spots, we avoid overly dry spots, we avoid areas where animals might congregate, fences, trees, any of these things that could skew our data. So it's not just kind of the surface spatial nature, but we also have a good representation of the depth, right? How do we take 1 or 10 or 20 acres, whatever it is, 6 or 8 inches deep, poke enough holes in the ground to figure out what that looks like consistently? And so I think it'd be a good one for maybe a different topic, but there are a lot of different ways that we can guide ourselves to this. We can look at it from a management aspect, right? Dwane's got one cornfield. He goes out, pokes a bunch of holes. That whole cornfield's treated the same way. He can look at it on like a soil type or a topographical type management where he knows there's a change in the soils. He knows this part's lower and this part's higher, and so he samples those differently. We can get into grid sampling, right? And there are all of these different ways that you can grid sample. You can do it kind of from one prism and take a bunch around it. You can do one prism, like one kind of point every so often. Soil sampling can be very, very complicated. And my advice to most people when they do that is sample to the level of management in which you can work at, right? If you know that you can't kind of get in this a very finite level, you know that you're not going to split apply anything, you know that you're not going to adjust tonnages, what you're doing is creating more work and more effort for yourself that you're going to frustrate yourself. Start very large, and then as you see these managements gets better, then we start talk about other ways to take these samples.
Sure, and I think that's a great point is defining your management zone, right? So like this is all based on a zone, right? So if we're looking at are we doing this by field? Well, that depends are you rotating by field, right? So the approach that I usually see people doing is like I have this one field that gets rotated, corn, soybean, and in the next field over, it's rotated soybean, corn. Then break it up that way, right? It's all based on, like you said, what your management practices are. And usually when I talk how to take a soil test with folks, I usually recommend in that management zone taking 15 to 20 samples. I don't know, is that the number that you guys usually land on?
I usually go for make sure you try to get at least a dozen.
And I
Dozen?
think I think there's this thing where you tell someone, "Hey, get 20 samples," and they go out and they're like, "Yeah, that isn't going to be a big deal."
20
And
is a
then they get
lot.
to about 6 and they're like, "Oh my gosh," especially if they don't have a soil
Uh-huh.
probe, right? If you're talking to someone with a shovel, and like I say like I know this can be challenging. So don't get frustrated. Take your samples, be consistent. But I agree if you're getting a dozen, I mean, something's better than nothing.
Yeah, yeah. Okay,
But
cool.
what
It's
I try to
the
stress
scientific mind that makes me want to say 15 to 20, but I think a dozen is a good amount.
I try to stress to folks, I believe when we did a tour of the soil test lab up there at Penn State one time, the Penn State kits say, all right, you want to fill the bag to a certain line, and that's about a cup worth of soil. So you're trying to aggregate whatever that is, a 10-acre field, at 20 acres into that cup. But out of that cup, I believe they use about a teaspoon when they're actually testing that soil. So I try to indicate the importance of, you know, garbage in, garbage out. Like
Yep.
Justin just mentioned, if you're varying your depth, if you get 3 or 4 cores and say, you know what, the heck with it. I throw the towel in. You're only going to get a result that's as good as what you're putting into it.
And I think for perspective, right? Like, what's a half a cup of soil weigh? 4, 5, 6 ounces, right? And so when we think about that six or at 6 inch, 7, 8 inch depth, we're thinking about 2 million pounds of soil per acre. That now Dwane says we need a cup of it. So if we've got 10 acres, 2 million pounds an acre, we've got 20 million pounds of soil that we're trying to figure out how to get these samples pulled out, put them in a bucket, stir them up, make this composite or aggregate sample, then pull a cup of that and base our management on it, right? I mean, you're kind of fighting a losing battle. So the more the better, I think, is kind of the key to take away from how many samples or how many subsamples you should be collecting.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, and now to get into the nitty gritty of like how you actually take these samples, that matters too, right? So, like we use soil probes, and like I think if you're going to be taking these at any kind of frequency, as you probably should if you're managing a farm, I think that's a very worthwhile investment because it saves a lot of time over, the shovel method where you put that soil probe into that 6 to 8 inch depth, you get a really consistent sample. You twist that probe, pull it out, and then you have your core. That's a really great way to get a consistent sample. There are other methods, and we'll attach those in a link as well. If you just have a shovel, you can dig like a triangular pit and then take a 1 inch slice along the side. So as you can tell, that takes a little bit more time. So if you are doing these with frequency, invest in a soil probe, or if you want to try this out, talk to your local extension agent, and they might be able to set you up with one. So that's so once you have those cores, if I'm taking 15, 20 samples, I'll usually have a bucket and I'll put all those samples in the bucket and I'll break up all those cores and mix it all together, and then I'll pull my 1 cup sample. And what's important there is if the soil's a little wet, you might want to let it dry a little bit, because when the soil gets sent to the lab, they need a dry sample, and the longer it takes them to dry it down in the lab, the longer your results will take to get back. And there are some inaccuracies that can happen if they really need to dry it down quite a lot.
Plus, you're going to be sending that through the either, well,
That's right.
maybe going through the postal service, or if you live close enough, you deliver it locally, but you're going to pay for water weight shipping. Yep. So you might as well let it dry out. I've done the same thing. My advice is let it sit out, dry it out overnight at least, put it on top of the or the stove at night, not the kitchen stove, but the wood stove or something like that. Let it dry out.
So I was always taught, and maybe you guys have an opinion or not on this, but when you're drying them, if you're interested in organic matter, which a lot of our producers are, you don't want to put them on anything like porous to dry, right? If you don't care about organic matter, you can dry them on newspaper or a paper plate or something like that. But if you're drying for organic matter, as that stuff sits there, you start to lose some of those acids, and some of those things start to come out and get absorbed into that paper product, and that can skew that data. I don't know. I mean, that was any thoughts or opinions on that? It seems reasonable to me just through chemical properties.
It does, Justin. I mean, I can tell you, I've not, that was new news to me, but it does make sense.
Well, you heard it here first.
That's right. You learn something new every day.
There you go. My job's done for the day because I learned something new as well. So we'll go with
it. And
it.
it could be totally wrong, right? I mean, that's the crazy part about this. You learn something new, but you don't know if it was something right or something wrong, but still something new nonetheless.
Sure. Well, so that's a nugget of things that our listeners can go out there and do their own research and learn more about.
So I think we've talked about real world, why it matters. We've talked about where you get your kit. We've talked about how you collect your sample, what you need to do. You're mailing it to your lab. I think this is another great question that I kick around a lot is, what is the best time of year that you should be doing this, and with what kind of frequency?
Yeah, thoughts? I guess.
Sorry, yeah. You guys have thoughts on that?
I do. Yeah. So I guess the best time of year, I think the fall is king, of the best time of year to sample. The reason I say that is because specifically when it comes to pH, one of the biggest things that's going to impact your soil, and like if you can do anything to amend your soil, it's can we increase the pH of the soil, because then it impacts the ability of all kinds of nutrients to be accessed by the plant, right? That's why we want to get our soil to a neutral pH. Well, anyways, liming often takes 3 to 6 months to actually act in the soil. So if you're doing like a standard rotation of corn, soybean as your cash crop, then taking a soil test in the fall enables you the ability to maybe do a late fall application of your limestone, of these other fertilizers, and have that pH be active when you go in, or a little bit more active when you go in the spring. So I think that's the best time, but really there is no wrong time with soil testing. You can do it any time of year. If the ground's frozen, you're not going to be able to do it with as much success. So the fall's a good time. The spring is another great time to do it. Just know that it's going to impact your ability to get in there and change the pH quickly. So I think fall first, spring second, and then any other time after that. Any other thoughts?
No, I agree. Hey, fall's usually the time we say to folks, this is a great opportunity for you. Crops are off, if crops are off, right? Makes it a
Yeah.
little bit easier to maneuver around that field versus mid-July or something when you're trying to snake through corn rows that are up over your head. So from my standpoint, yeah, if the crops are off the ground, or crops are off the field, it makes it a heck of a lot easier to do soil test in row crop fields. But to your point, Ryan, as far as making anything work with liming recommendations, now's the best time to be doing that, to try to get that on the field for next year.
I don't know that I've had a conversation about soil testing in this way, but as we're talking about it, what I'm hearing in these common threads is just like the importance of consistency, right? We've said consistent lab, we've said consistent date. Dwane mentioned about crops. One of the big things about sampling at a consistent time of year is, let's say Dwane samples in May or April of this year, and then 3 years from now, right, when his cycle comes up, he samples in the fall. Now he experienced the removal rate of that last year's crop, right? And so that's one of the key benefits of fall sampling is you're past the crop harvest, you're past that removal rate. But if you go fall one year, spring the next time, now that removal rate of that crop is starting to show up. We also see differences in like the temperature of the soil, right? Like one of the things that's really hard to chase is like sulfur and zinc problems, because like they're pretty affected by temperatures and things that can swing in the spring and fall. So, in what Ryan said, right? Like, if someone calls and they say, hey, it's July, I've not sampled in 20 years. If you've got the momentum, get outside, right? Like, I'm never going to talk someone out of sampling if this is the first time in 10 or 20 years they've done it. There's no time like the present if you're motivated, and you just don't want to lose that.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think the consistency and timing, that is important. But as you're saying, like, we also have farm operations to run, right? So also find the time that makes sense in your operation. It might be different than someone else, and then stick to it. Stick to it so that you can build your recommendations over time. So I think that kind of goes into your second part of the question, frequency. You kind of talked about this a little bit, but these tests are usually written on a 3-year interval. And so what that means is the lime recommendation to adjust the pH is made so that this is the amount of lime that you should make over the course of 3 years, or, all at once for that 3-year period. And then your fertility recommendations, your P's and K's, and some nitrogen for crop removal are going to be made on a per year basis. Okay. So really the first, you should start by using a 3-year rotation. So soil tests every 3 years. Now, as you kind of build up a history of soil testing, you'll start to learn what works for you, what works in your system. And as long as that system is continuing, I do see people kind of stepping back a little bit. Maybe I wait till fourth year or so. So that's definitely an option, but really you want to, you're new to this and you're really trying to understand and study your system, 3 years is the best for the frequency. And you might not want to do all your fields in 1 year, right? You might want to say, okay, this is the third of my farm that I do this year. This is the third that I do the next year, that kind of thing.
And I think that makes sense, right? It's workload, it's the cost of the fertilizer and the lime, it's the cost of the soil testing. I think that those systems are very, very thought out and very well established when you do a third of your acres every 3 years, essentially, right? I think that makes a ton of sense.
And I think anytime there's a change in management, if you're picking up
Mhm.
any new ground, right, that's one of the first things we're going to do is try to put a baseline there.
And this
Um,
conversation about how frequent, so I've had conversations with our lab director, John Spargo, and John, I mean, he said, like, if you're going to put lime out, it doesn't behoove you to take a sample within 18 months, right? Especially if you're thinking about nutrients and pH effect on those kind of things too, is you've not seen the full effect of that lime. You really don't know where things are. So I think this idea of like yearly sampling can almost make us chase our tails a little bit more because we're not seeing all the breakdowns of all of these things in the soil at a fast enough rate to know what they're going to do. I think we've run through a bunch of this stuff.
Yeah.
Um, again, we'll stress the consistency. We've talked depth, we've talked year, we've talked how often. I don't know. Do we want to get into the conversation of uh, reagents and the acids that are used to get into this, or do we think we want to leave that for another day?
it's above my pay grade of what, what they typically, I mean, I know okay, there's the different tests, the Malick, the Bray. Hey, we focus at Penn State on this one. This is what is, but hey, Justin, if you know,
I mean, my 30,000 foot, right? And I'm going to kind of jump back in here and again. Remember, this is soil testing basics, right? This is back to
Mhm.
basics. If you are like, boy, I'm thirsting for more information on soil test extractants, then let us know. We'd be happy to do that. Again, I think this is part of that consistency. Like Dwane mentioned, there are lots of different kinds. Malick 1 and Malick 3 are probably the most popular that I see. There are Brays, Morgans, Olsons, all of this stuff that floats around. But my advice is contacting or working with your extension agency to see what your land grant and what your extension deems to be the best extractable type reagent that you can use in your state, right? So for us in Pennsylvania, it's Malick 3. And so a lot of labs are using that because that data becomes comparable, right? If you have a parts per million of 20 in Malick 1 versus a parts per million in Malick 3, the addition of fertilizer is not the same for those two numbers, right? They are not exchangeable, and you can't look at fertilizer recommendations just because it's a 20 parts per million. And when we think about that, like kind of specifically, Pennsylvania's recommendations are for Malick 3 extractable nutrients. We don't have that set of data. We haven't done that research. We don't have that log that says, well, I decided to use Malick 1 or Bray. What do I need to add? Now you have to start going to a state or a university that has that set of data and hoping it translates well to your farm and your soils in a different environment, right? I think that's kind of a 30,000 foot. I don't know, maybe you guys have more to add, or maybe that makes more questions. But I think the importance of that is talk to extension, find out what they're doing, and try and stick with that, so because your recommendations are going to be most accurate for what you're trying to achieve in your area.
Yeah, I think that's a great overview of, why one lab would use one procedure over another, or solution to extract the soil. Now, what I'll say about these recommendations as well, the recommendations on your soil tests are built, at least in Pennsylvania, with our lab based on field trials. So they use this Melic 3 extractant to get these build the profile of what nutrients are in the soil, and then they make recommendations. And those aren't just recommendations that they're choosing or deciding in a lab. They actually go out in the field and have a long history of trialing. Let's look at this result from this Melic 3 test, and then put a trial out there where we do fertility response trials. So we add the fertility at different rates, and then look at what rate do we see a crop response, and where do we see that crop response kind of plateau, and then they build their recommendations on it. So one of the reasons, so that just adds strength to the recommendation, and I think it's some good context to understand what you're getting with some of these protocols.
you're right. Like they've been, I'd use the word calibrated. So
Mm.
they've been calibrated for our yield types and goals here in Pennsylvania. So it is important to understand that you're using an appropriate lab with that extractant and calibrated for our Pennsylvania climate, not climate, but our Pennsylvania yields.
And So in prepping for this, I read a really interesting fact sheet from the Oregon Extension Service Soil Test Interpretation Guide, right? And I think the way they summarized it was probably the most real way I've seen this done is when you're in this low level, right? If you look at a Penn State soil test, your interpretations or your results are going to say low, optimum, above optimum, or below optimum, optimum, and above optimum. And the way that they summarize this and they look at it is they say if you're in this below optimum, that means, yes, you will see a response from adding fertilizer, right? You are low enough when you're below optimum, you put it out, there's a significant chance over the years of data and calibration that that will improve your yield. If you're above optimum, what they're saying is there are enough extractable nutrients for that plant in the soil that applying fertilizer, there's a low chance that you're going to see that change. And where they really got me is their middle, they call that the maybe zone, right? And so we call it optimum, but when they're looking at it, maybe you will see an increase, right? It's going to depend a lot on the weather and the soils and the crop and when it's applied. But that optimum zone is where you can kind of say, I don't know, maybe we should put a little bit on, maybe we should offset with removal. But we look at this as yes, maybe no, when you're kind of tabulating or deciding if it's worth the effort to put the soil test out. And I thought that made a lot of sense in very relatable, understandable terms.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the other things that we were talking before this episode is that those recommendations are also adjusted based on the soil test, like the soil type, right? So the optimum in a clay-based soil might be different than how a sandy soil will respond. So that's just kind of another reason why using a local test that's calibrated to the local environment is important. Yeah, so I think we kind of jumped into this conversation about soil extractants. So just in case you're not aware, I'll give you just a snapshot of what happens when your soil test reaches a lab and how you get to a result of the actual plant available nutrients and then your recommendation. So what happens is you send the sample in, they get it, right? They will take that cup of sample and as Justin indicated, well, they'll grind it up real small and they'll take a teaspoon of that soil to be tested. And first they do their pH test, okay, which is a separate test from this Melic 3 test that we were just talking about. Then they take another small sample and it goes through this extraction with the Melic 3 extractant and they take that solution and then that solution goes to what we call an ICP. And an ICP is just a spectrometer, so a device that measures the amount of all different types of compounds in there. And they know based on a standard of different, they'll have a standard for potassium, phosphorus, all these things. They know where in that spectrometer all of these compounds come out in the chemical analysis. So that's how they get to how much of all of these extractable nutrients are in your sample. And then they use that to make a recommendation. So that's kind of a really quick snapshot, not in depth at all, but that's how we're getting these results. Okay, so maybe we can get to just cover a little bit about the results, and I think then our conversation will be wrapped up here. So we go through that whole process, and then in 3 to 5 days after you submit a sample, hopefully you'll get back a soil test report. Okay, so these soil test reports, there's an option that you can also copy someone else to receive the report. If you're unsure about how to interpret these, you can, put your local extension educator there or someone else that you can rely on who can also get a copy of these results. And so why don't we talk a little bit, just really practically, we get this form, how do we interpret it?
Dwane, you want to start or do you want me to start?
Sure. No, so you're going to get the form back either via email or postal mail, and it's going to have some bar graphs on it in the top section, and going to give you a snapshot of where your pH, where your phosphorus, your potassium, and your magnesium are. And Justin, you had just referenced, it goes through three basic areas of that graph, whether that's below optimum, optimum, or above optimum. Gives you a quick snapshot of where those nutrient levels are at the current point. Then it's going to go and spill into your recommendations, and then start with its limestone recommendation. Give you a recommendation in either pounds per acre on a field scale or pounds per square foot on a yard or garden type of a scale. And then your specific nutrient recommendations for the crops that you're going to plant on a 3-year cycle. Start with nitrogen, and again, that is based on the yield goal that you're providing for that specific crop. And then your P2O5 and your K2O, your phosphate and potash recommendations. So um, you can base your soil test nutrient levels on those recommendations. You can adjust them. If you're in the above optimum, it's going to tell you, all right, there's, like Justin said, likely no crop response from adding additional nutrients. If you're in the optimum, you can base it on applying those nutrients based on crop removal. Maybe some economics of fertilizer takes this into account. If we're in a period of high input prices and you're looking to sharpen that pencil when you're putting that budget together, maybe you're only looking to put on for crop removal at this point versus building up into that optimum level. So different management strategies can be applied to how you want to tackle your nutrient solutions, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's like, a really good overview of what you're looking at. And so Ryan mentioned earlier, we're going to talk about the Penn State Analytical Services Lab report, and we're going to attach a file in the show notes about like interpreting these and how you can walk through them. So when you look at other labs, or even the Penn State, if I start there, like there is an enormous amount of information on this sheet, right? Sometimes it takes or agronomist, right, to kind of help you work through what some of this stuff is. And you start getting in thinking about a calcium, or excuse me, the acidity or the cation exchange capacity and base saturations. Those are very popular ways for people to want to balance soils, right? And there are these like golden ratios within base saturation. And I think we can kind of get hung up on that a little bit. But I think just like Dwane described, what we're looking for is these numbers over the course of that 3 years, right, of your next 3 cropping cycles. Those are going to offset deficiencies and also kind of account for some removal when you're looking at them, right? And so keeping these numbers where they are, when you test back in 3 years, you should be much closer to that optimum or that like maybe range of where you're going to see a response or not. And when you haven't done soil testing for a very long time, a lot of these numbers come back very large, right? If you're in a perennial hay system, I see a lot of things all the time that are saying 250, 270 pounds of potash is what you're required to get out of the hole you're in, right? That's not an obtainable goal. And so I think that's where Ryan mentioned you can attach someone or add someone to this. I think that's where working with an agronomist can help you take this in more bite-sized pieces, right? I see people, they get them, they read, they review it, they call a service agronomist and say, hey, what can I do? Oh my gosh, it's going to cost me $850 an acre a year to get out of this hole, right? And then they start to spiral or panic. Don't let yourself go down that rabbit hole, right? Call one of us, call someone that you're working with, and let them talk you through how you make a plan to get over this hump and kind of start working towards that over the next few years.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like these should be viewed as like this is your optimal recommendation.
Right.
That
Yep.
doesn't mean that it's the only thing you can do, right? Like it honestly, oftentimes if you need to apply that much, it really isn't what you should be doing, right? It's how can we practically get there? And that can be adjusted for a number of reasons, right? And so it is important to have this looked over as well by someone who can help you if you are unsure of how to interpret it.
I
And
think the hardest part for me when reviewing a soil test, and maybe you guys feel this way too, but someone calls and I'm looking at this example that says we need 60 pounds of phosphate and 70 pounds of potash. And they say, what's the best way for me to get that? That is such a difficult question for us to answer because we don't know what company you're going to work with. We don't know if it's, if it's a local co-op, if it's somewhere else, if you're wanting to buy bags of stuff, if you're wanting to go in bulk. We don't know what these companies are going to have as an option for them to even blend or give you in bulk. And so like if you can do a little bit of this research too and say, hey, I'm going to call my local agronomy supplier and I'm going to find a list of what fertilizers they have options to. That makes these calculations and that makes this so much easier for us because typically if it's phosphorus, we're thinking either, MAP or DAP, monoammonium phosphate or diammonium phosphate's the best way to get it. When we're thinking nitrogen, right? Is it urea? Is it UAN? Is it AMS? Is it, it just goes on and on. And we can spin out 100 different recommendations, but when you call them, like, sorry, we don't have that. Doesn't right now. We're starting
Right.
back over at square one.
Yeah,
So
I'm with you.
very,
That's
very important to know what your local supplier
Yeah.
has, because that's going to dictate the recipe that we're going to recommend.
Yeah, definitely. Like it's if you're too glued to these numbers, you can spend a lot of money
Yeah.
just in saying like you don't maybe I need 200 0 100, but I can't find a source that has that kind of ratio. Well, we need to find a ratio that's as close to the ratio that you need, and then manage some of those the pros and cons of that, and so that's where taking this to if you have a trusted supplier of fertilizer as well, that's a great way to bring this test and have that conversation with them, or you get that information from them and go to your educator, right? It's not a one size fits all kind of thing. Okay, so any other comments on interpreting a soil test? I think that's probably a good and
So
really that we have a more in-depth article that will link to this as
yeah.
well. So if you're really interested in looking at it, seeing it, and stepping through this process, we'll put that up as well.
So the last thing I want to mention is about trace elements or your
Hmm.
micronutrients, right? And our Penn State soil test will give you zinc, copper, and sulfur. It's very popular to have some of these other labs where they can test a lot of these. And I'm by no means an expert in this, but I've had a lot of conversations with people that are. And I think that these are kind of challenging to use in a way that's going to work you through like a fertility program, right? A lot of times, so sulfur, for example, right? And the one I'm looking at says 9.5 parts per million. Sulfur is very similar to nitrogen in this aspect of we're thinking at removal rates, right? If you're a legume crop, you might be 20 to 30 pounds. If you're a grass forage, it might be 15 to 20, right? And there are these ratios of 10 to 1 nitrogen to sulfur when you're applying these things. When we put out sulfur and we soil test, right, we're soil testing in that top 6, 7, 8 inches. If we're in a perennial forage, it might only be 3 or 4. But what is happening with a lot of our sulfur, and research at the university shows this, is it's leaching out of the top, but being trapped in the subsoil in that 18 to 24 inch mark. And so if you're using this topsoil as your metric and saying, well, there's nothing up here, we got to apply all this to it, especially in perennial systems where you've got really deep roots that can grab some of that stuff, these numbers just don't match, right? Like you might have a very good sulfur profile deep, and now you're treating for the top because this soil test says you need 26 pounds of sulfur because it's not in the top, right? And I think the same thing can happen with zinc and boron. And as we mentioned with timing, these extractions, what they're designed to do is mimic a plant root and what the plant can get, right? And so if the sulfur or the zinc or something is in a form that's not plant available, it's not going to really show up in this test. And if you're taking them in the fall and it's cool and wet and really overcast, we start to see like zinc be a lower number, right? We see zinc deficiencies in corn a lot in the spring because it's cool and it's wet. As soon as the sun comes out, as soon as it dries out, zinc's back out there. So all of this is just kind of this long-winded way to say, be careful when you're looking at trace elements and try and judge everything with them. They're incredibly hard to research. They're incredibly hard to calibrate the way that we've done with phosphorus and potassium. And I think before you just kind of sign off and say, this is my prescription, I need all of these things, I think you should do a little research with your own extension in your own area to see what people are thinking works within your soils and profiles.
Great
Yeah.
advice. I think that's very sound, Justin. Very sound advice.
Yeah, and I will say, a lot of times when we're talking about these trace elements, this is where we get into looking at deficiencies, right? Like
Yep.
this is where we look at the evidence of something that's not there. We don't look at our soil to see like how much of it, because it's trace, right? Like it's not something that's really correlative, based
Yep.
on your soil type for all the reasons you just talked about. And so for that reason, this is where we look at the crop, and if we see something that might be a nutrient deficiency, we should go about doing some plant tissue testing, right? So we have a episode on exactly that. If you go back to season 3, episode 24, we talk a lot about this and how we actually take plant tissue tests to look for some of these deficiencies and how we can interpret them. Like, is this actually a problem with adding that fertility, or if it was it really wet, or there's a lot of questions downstream of that, but that's probably a better way to actually understand that.
Very early in my career, and maybe this set the tone for my feeling about this, but I worked with a producer. He was in Butler County, Pennsylvania, kind of middle of the state in the West. And he had a cornfield that parts of it were showing a lot of this deficiency, right? You saw a lot of this yellow streaking in it. The other part was dark green, looked beautiful. We went in, we soil sampled, and we tissue tested the good and the bad. And what we found was basically the lower lying areas in that soil were suffering from zinc deficiencies, right? Because it was wet, it was cold, plant tissue was below sufficiency, the soil was showing that there wasn't any there. You took 20 steps to your right or your left or something a little higher, soil test levels were good on zinc, and crop tissue samples showed sufficient in zinc, right? And that can tell you how hard it can be to chase some of these across these fields early in the spring. And that's why it's very popular to have a little bit of zinc as a starter, or, throw some sulfur out there, because then we don't have to worry about phosphorus starters the same way, right? That stuff's cool. It's wet. It doesn't move. But these are some of these real life things that you see. And I just want people to be cautious before they go all in on some of these programs.
Definitely. And I think on that, so maybe this is like we can talk a little bit about some practical advice, and we'll leave you on that. I think the trace elements, that's a really important part of this conversation. Other practical stuff, one thing that we didn't touch on that I always try to cover when we're talking about soil testing, really soil testing is one of the most affordable things you can do to reduce the cost that you incur on a lot of inputs. So, the soil test, it's $10, and that $10 can go a long way when you're adjusting your fertilizers, your input costs, your limes, because you're really that $10 goes a long way in making sure you're actually putting out what will get you a crop response. So I just want to make sure we said that.
But Dwane may have a different opinion of this, but I'm not sure there's anything else you can do on your farm that's any cheaper that has the potential to save you any more money than a soil test.
I would agree 100%.
Yeah.
In my mind, here I am going, all right, it's a $10 soil test. If we have a 5-acre field over the course of 3 years,
yeah,
what are we talking here?
When phosphorus is $900+ a ton, right?
Yep.
I mean, it doesn't take very many changes in pounds per acre to offset $10 with these kind of fertilizer prices.
And to the inverse, it also doesn't take much yield to right. So if you're finding that, wow, I actually have to spend a little bit more on fertilizer, but the benefit will pay that back as well, so there
3 bushels of corn pays for it in the first year, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. So I think that's a good note. Anything else before we close this out, or do you think we did a good job here?
I think this was a great starting point for Back to Basics. I hope everyone, I hope you learn this, right? And take it for what it's worth. We're not trying to change anyone's mind on where they send their tests. We're not trying to change anyone's ideas of how they're running their farm. What we're trying to do is just give a little bit better foundation and understanding of why soil testing happens and why it's important on your operation.
Amen.
Awesome. Well, great way to end it. Justin, Dwane, I appreciate you guys all jumping on here today to talk about this. So thanks, guys. And to our listeners, thank you all for listening to us. And I hope you got something out of this Back to Basics episode, and we'll do some more of these in the future. We'll see you on the next episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast.